Well, we're trying to learn more about Paul and who he was and how his vision and understanding were shaped and how he went about his missionary work. We have Paul's letters that give us one view, and then we have Acts that gives us Luke's view and understanding, which is sometimes the same and sometimes they go different directions in describing Paul and his work. But at the last where we were was Paul and Barnabas had kind of split. Paul was really upset with Barnabas and siding with James and the others in Jerusalem about the issues on dietary concerns and all, but they did decide to go their separate missions. And so when Paul is out from under the direction or supervision or apprenticeship under Barnabas, he takes a different approach, a new strategy. Borg and Crowson explained that unlike Barnabas and unlike Jesus, Paul was a city boy. We know Jesus was small town village person, and Barnabas seemed to be also. And so they were more comfortable going to the small villages to do their mission work, or he was, and Jesus seemed to be comfortable there. But Paul was an urban dweller. He not only had the education we had talked about before, but he seemed to have street smarts. He knew how things worked in the cities. So Barnabas and Jesus were the rural, small-town village dwellers and understood that environment and were comfortable there. And we remember how Jesus taught and ministered in villages and small towns, and so many of his parables were from the rural farming and handcraft kinds of experiences. Speaks of buying a field. We don't buy fields in cities. Planting seed, harvest. The harvest is ripe. Where are the workers to go into the harvest? The shepherd and the sheep. All of these rural expressions and metaphors that he used in his parables. Paul not only seems to concentrate his work in the cities, but moreover the capital cities in the Roman Empire, in the provinces. Now, when we look at those cities with architectural studies and archaeological studies, we have found great villas and temples and the forums and porticos and fountains and the public baths. Now, even though we have those remnants from this high period of architectural achievements of the Greek and the Roman culture and the power and might, to build all of those things, you don't get volunteers. You use your slaves to do all that heavy labor to build these great things that are left. Now, they've fallen down and, they're not in good repair, but they were so solid and that they have withstood time, whereas so many of the dwellings of the working class and the poor were wood. It's gone. It's decayed. A lot of times it burned down. They would have to try to cook in their little apartments and 4 or 5, 6 stories high in really cramped areas, and often caught on fire and would burn. But anyway, Paul's ministry was in these crowded neighborhoods of the ordinary common folk. Many were poor and destitute, and their dwellings were this tight, crowded, very narrow streets that were virtually the open sewers. We've seen pictures of in Haiti and India where it's so crowded and they don't have good plumbing, good sewer systems, and the street becomes the sewer line. So it was really, really nasty and not healthy at all. But Anyway, Paul worked among the urban working class, and they lived in these areas, but he gives a list of all the different kinds of jobs that these people had, just to get a little better understanding, because the jobs we've got going on often aren't these kind. But anyway, there were drivers of the different, vehicles that they had. Carts that would pull things, drovers that would herd the cattle and the sheep into market, and porters that carried things, cleaners, custodians of the public buildings, and the bathhouse attendants, construction workers, because they're always having to build new things, either the things out of stone or building the apartments after they've all burned down. They have to build them back. Bricklayers, masons, carpenters, tanners. So much of clothing and the tents or awnings they made were made out of skins. Butchers, bakers, spinners, weavers, artisans in the workshop, working with cloth and leather, pottery, gold, silver, wood, stone, everything made by hand. They didn't have machine shops. And then entrepreneurs and shopkeepers of various kinds selling the goods. And then day laborers looking for work, sometimes not finding any. We have stories about that. The one day's wage, if you could get it, was just enough to feed your family. And if you didn't get work that day, then you didn't feed your family. Anyway, so Paul was among these different artisans and workers, but the congestedness of the cities, the big thing that happened was these cities were walled. And if the population grew, they didn't get outside the walls and go out and create the suburbs. They had walls because it was dangerous. They needed the protection. So as the population grew inside of the walls, they didn't sprawl out, they went up and just added more stories onto the tenements. But Croson and Borg gave us some comparative numbers to compare today. They said in Chicago it has 21 people per acre of land that lived in Chicago, in their houses, with their garages and their lawns to mow, or maybe some condos. In San Francisco, it's 23 people per acre. Manhattan, New York City has 100 people per acre, but they have high-rises. But in Antioch, for example, it had 75,000 people per square mile, or 117 people per acre if you took in the whole city. However, the public buildings, the villas of the few wealthy people, took up 40% of the land, which left only 60% for these urban dwellers, the artisans and the poor and the working class, which then concentrated it to 200 people per acre. Now, what's an acre? Well, you think the church property here at this corner is an acre with our parking lot? Yeah. Or taking in the ones across the street? Okay. So there'd be 200 people living, sleeping within this space. Now, we've got a tower. We could put a lot of people. But anyway, so there's a lot of people concentrated. Now, because of the unsanitary conditions, the mortality rates were pretty high, and there were fires where people would burn and die from that. But as bad as it was better than out in the countryside, because with the Roman influence, they were doing away with the subsistence farmers who could raise enough for themselves and feed their families and have a little left over to sell and have a little cash. But property was being bought up or taken over by big land owners who were trying to develop the land for big commercial reasons, to sell to bigger places or to support the armies, because you can't send an army off somewhere unless you take the supplies and the food and so forth to feed the army. So anyway, a lot of the subsistence farmers were not able to stay on the land, and so they were coming to the cities. So even though there's a lot of death there, there was a steady influx of people trying to come to the city to find a better life. But anyway, Crowson and Borg remind us, or tell us for the first time, that migration to the cities created many different linguistic and ethnic groups, just as migrations today. We get different ethnic and cultural groups being congested in the high population areas. Today it's from drought and the war-torn areas in Africa and the Middle East, Central and South America. But they have uncovered traces and evidence that there were 18 ethnic quarters, like the Italian and the Chinese and things that we have in our cities today, 18 different ethnic quarters within the 2 square miles of 150,000 population in Antioch. Well, needless to say, people didn't communicate any better then than we do today. And so conflicts and violence would erupt into riots. So we had all of that, or they had all that going on, and this was the environment in which Paul was trying to minister. This area in the cities where the working class lived with these different ethnic groups, so that was places of misery and danger, fear, despair, hatred, violence erupting from time to time. It was this environment that Paul tried to preach the good news about Jesus. So, where would Paul stay? Where would he live while he's on his mission? He was a tent maker. Did he make a tent and pitch it in the street? No, didn't do that. Where did he get his money to pay for the necessities of just staying alive? Well, you may remember in different places Paul had claimed to be a tent maker, earning his own way, not being a burden on the church, that he earned his own way. So he did that as a tent maker. Now, Borg and Crowson tell us that the tents were not like the tents we think of today, the Boy Scout tents for campouts, or the little family tents if your family would go camping. They weren't those kinds of tents. Actually, it was more like awnings that would be over the downstairs floor, over the shops, to keep your customers from having the chamber pot and other stuff dumped out of the apartments above and getting on them. Or on the top floors where they had no air conditioning. And so they would pitch awnings, sort of like we have out in the child care area, to provide shade for the folks on the roof when they go up there to get a little breeze, but yet not catch the full sun. So it was probably more like awnings than the tents we think of, where they're all enclosed and covered. In Acts 18:3, we read that because he was of the same trade, Paul stayed with Aquila and Priscilla in Corinth, and they worked together. By trade, they were tent makers or awning artisans. Now, his tools were light. He didn't have to take hammer and saws and stuff. It was more needles and threads and hooks and whatnot. He could carry them with him. And we assume that a lot of his work would be patchwork and repair of older awnings that were always needing repair and patching. So he wouldn't need to have a huge inventory of material to be making new tents with. And he could do like he did with Priscilla and Aquila. He would take his trade and offer that trade to work in somebody else's shop, wherever he was, to earn his way. But he could, apply his skills and earn a living and have a place to work in the existing shops. And often people would, just sleep where they worked, just curl up in a corner. In these areas, businesses and shops were, as I said, on the ground floor, and all the residences and dwellings were upstairs. So he may have, had a spot upstairs with somebody. Now we see that in dense populated cities. You go and you see all the storefronts and the shops on the ground floor, but you look above and it looks like, 3 or 4 stories, 5 or 6 stories of apartments above the ground level shops. And I think they're doing that here in Tulsa, where they're developing north of us. So let's see. Anyway, so that's probably where he lived and how he managed when he went to the cities rather than the rural villages and towns. Now, in Luke, or in Acts by Luke, the description of Paul's ministry says that he went straight to the synagogue in the city to preach and convert the Jews, the circumcised to become Jewish Christians. Now, let's see, I had a note that here, they have various places that, it says, in every city he always starts in the synagogue with fellow Jews. But is that what Paul actually did? Is that what really happened? And then he goes on to say, when we look, it says, he was called to the Gentiles. First, the very start of his accounts is that his calling, he says, God chose to reveal his Son to me so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles. I mean, that's what Paul's description. Luke says he's going to the Jews. Second, that's the way he introduces himself in his letters. And in 50 of the Common Era, the agreement with the other apostles in Jerusalem, the Gentile converts did not need to be circumcised. So Paul's mission was to the uncircumcised. The other apostles' mission was to the Jews, the circumcised. And each was trying to bring them to Christ, to Jesus, but with each it was to become Jewish Christians. They still hadn't seen themselves as Christianity breaking away as an independent religion. But even the Gentiles were expected to become Jewish Christians, but with Paul, with the understanding they don't have to be circumcised. They made that allowance in that meeting in 50 of the Common Era. So if Paul isn't going to the synagogue to convert Jews, where does he go? Does he go to the pagan temples? Does he go to the secret mystery religion gatherings? Well, probably not. In first century, before the Common Era, and first century of the Common Era, and even beyond, there were both Jews and Gentiles who attended synagogue, even at the temple in Jerusalem. Remember when Jesus is driving out the money changers? Where is he driving them from? Well, they are in the Gentile courtyard. They had set up their money-changing tables to do business that was supposed to be reserved for the Gentiles. There was the inner court for the high priest and the sacrifices, and then the next level was for the Jewish folks who were bringing their sacrifices and offerings to the priest, and then the outer court was for the Gentiles, for they understood, some understood, we're to be a light to the nations. We're to welcome the Gentile world to come find and meet our God. We set the example, and so forth. So Jesus was upset by the Lord's house is to be a house of prayer, not this money-changing stuff. even if it's fair. It's still not appropriate to be in here. So there was probably not fair dealing there, and that probably made him a little angry too. Anyway.
Buy a dove or
No, that
offering to take up to the high priest.
Right. That was the whole point. But the other part of money changing, remember Jesus asked someone to show a coin, and whose image is on this? Well, it's Caesar. Well, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's and that which is God. Yeah, they were trying to trap him there. But the money changing was that image was a graven image. And we're not supposed to have graven images. But if you're dealing with the coin or the currency of the Roman Empire, you're going to be dealing with graven images. So if you're going to do business in the temple, before you get into the Holy of Holies, you don't take graven images. You don't take the coin. So you need to change that money into shekels or other kinds of currency in order to not profane the temple. But the money changers thought, well, it's okay to do that in the court of the Gentiles, not all the way outside where they should be. And then they would take the changed money and then buy the dove or the lamb. Oh, yeah. Right. Yeah, it was a business. Yeah, greed. And they're probably shortchanging or not dealing fairly. We just suspect that. And that's probably why added to the anger of Jesus. Not only are you in the wrong place, but you're cheating and double dealing here in God's house, where this is supposed to be the highest level of integrity and honesty and truth and goodness, and yet you're doing this kind of stuff. So anyway, but Gentiles were welcome. Anyway, there were two distinct and maybe three distinct groups attending synagogue within the cities. There were the Jews, and then there were Gentiles or Greeks. And Luke in Acts names the different groups. And Crowson and Borg say actually there's the third group was Gentiles who stayed Gentiles in regard to circumcision. They were Gentile synagogue adherents. They accepted the beliefs and the moral teachings and the family ethics and the communal values of the Jewish people. They recognized them as good, and they wanted to embrace them. And they attended synagogue worship faithfully and financially supported the work of the synagogue and the needs of the people that the synagogue cared for. The Greeks or Gentiles who would not fall under the adherent definition would be seekers, inquirers, or just curiosity passerbys who were, wondering, what is this all about? Well, they were welcome to come and see. But those of the definition of adherence were those who had heard and learned and accepted. The only difference was the men didn't get circumcised and go all the way. And so, but in every other way, they were very faithful to the customs and the synagogue worship. On a Jewish inscription on a synagogue door in Aphrodisias, a city of eastern Ephesus in modern Turkey, there were 126 names listed on the doors. We presume the donors were donating to the building fund. We still do this in some churches. You donate so many dollars and it paid for these 4 seats. We put a plaque on these 4 seats, and this is the Tankersley section. And if I paid for them, I'm going to sit there. anyway, we have that kind of custom. Or, the the Wozencraft Memorial Altar Table, or, different kinds of things. But we have a policy here, don't we, Jerry? We do not accept donations to buy certain things to put plaques. Sometime back, whenever it was, we felt like, oh my goodness, we would have plaques all over the place and people getting in conflicts over, I thought I bought these 4 chairs. No, you bought these 5, but not these 4. No, I want these 4. And so we don't get into that. But these names were on the door. We do have some plaques that put names. We have a list of chairmen of the board out in the hall where we honor, significant people, but we don't brand significant places in the church with people's names. Anyway. Yeah, that's right. A lot of churches, stained glass windows, have names, and we don't want to take away from that, because that naming things for contributors does help us get good things to happen. The Holloman family has been very, very generous, and so we've got the Holloman name on Methodist Manor buildings, and they've got one of the buildings in the St. John's complex that, if someone wants to do some good and they want folks to remember them as the ones that did some good here, left a good example, we're not going to dishonor that out in the community. We just felt like it wasn't going to be helpful here to break down every little thing with a plaque with a name on it. But on this Jewish inscription on the doors, there were 3 groups of names. 55% were Jews, 2% were converts, and 43% are synagogue adherents, called God worshipers. 9 of them were on the city council of the town or the city. So we have this very powerful evidence that the Jewish communities attracted people of wealth, education, and political influence. And of course, some of them Paul convinced to follow Jesus in the way. So synagogue adherents were called those fearing God or God-fearers, those devout before God and worshipers of God, all of which meaning the Hebrew God of the Old Testament and all the stories about God's acts of creation and saving the people throughout history. Acts 17:4, Luke includes a woman, Lydia, a worshiper of God, was a dealer in purple cloth. And in 16:14, he had added, a great many of the devout Greeks and not a few of the leading women in the expression. So in conclusion, Paul most likely did go to the provincial capital cities, to the Jewish synagogues, therein to convert the Gentile adherents to become Christian Jews. It would be easy to become a full member of the church or the way of Jesus through baptism and still avoid circumcision. Also, being synagogue adherents, they would already be quite knowledgeable about the Hebrew Scriptures, the main stories, the monotheism, the high moral principles. All Paul had to add was the story of Jesus, his crucifixion and resurrection, which then made him the expected Messiah that the adherents had heard about already. But it was, and the early church took this on, the suffering servant prophecies to identify how a crucified Messiah could be the Messiah. So when Paul preached in the synagogue, he was trying to poach the adherents from the Jewish folks. The rabbis and the synagogue leaders were telling the adherents, stay with us and stay with the tradition. This Paul is trying to lead you astray with this fantastic story about a pretend Messiah. But Paul was saying to the converts, or to the adherents, convert to Christian Judaism. Not a breakaway new religion, but just a way of understanding Judaism that's different from the tradition that the promises have been fulfilled. They were fulfilled with Jesus. You can be a Jewish Christian and forego circumcision. Now, in that regard, they didn't think up Christianity in order to make it easy for the Gentile adherents. It was based upon what they believed about Jesus, and the change that made to all the rules of Judaism were no longer necessary in the same way because things had changed with the coming of Jesus. So this was not Judaism light, not cheap grace that we speak about in the church, but not an easy way to get more numbers, but the whole basis of Judaism had changed because of Jesus. But in Paul's mind, it was still Judaism, just it was a post-Messiah Judaism or a Christian Judaism. So how did Paul operate? Now, synagogue worship may have been once a week. Now, it had been developed in the Babylonian captivity, the exile, since the Jewish people carried off into exile were no longer in Jerusalem with the temple. Now, the temple had been the main worship style available to them, where they could make their animal and grain and oil offerings and sacrifices. But the synagogue worship had no high church worship with processionals and great choruses singing the psalms like they had in temple worship. But rather they were more like a kind of a cross between a prayer service and a Sunday school class. Scripture reading and prayers along with teaching from the rabbis. You know how that teaching worked? The rabbi would sit and the students would stand. I wonder when the rebellion happened to make the people sit and the rabbi stand. Anybody curious about that, you can get some extra credit and bring a report and tell us when did that transition happen when the rabbi, the teacher, had to stand and the students got to sit. It may have been like Paul. It was the story where a boy fell asleep and fell out the window. See, the boy was sitting in the windowsill. Now, if he'd been standing, he wouldn't have fallen asleep and tumbled out the window. However, when I was in college and did have to stand in line, I think I was kind of sick, and I was at the infirmary, and their flu or something was going around, and I could sleep standing up. I could position myself, and I could do it. I could do it. Fortunately, it wasn't in a windowsill, and I didn't fall out. Anyway, the main purpose of the synagogue worship in its beginning was to remind the Hebrew people who were taken away from their land, taken away from their temple, taken away from their social and cultural structures that they could control, and to remind them about three basic things: who they were, whose they were, and how they should live. Now, being exiles in a foreign and strange land, they were expected to be assimilated and their identity and separateness disappear and to kind of blend in with the dominant culture. Synagogue worship was a vital, life-saving experience for the people as a whole, as a living community. But there is also the Sabbath in the home worship, and the Passover and the Seder meal in the home, again to remind the people who they were, whose they were, and how they should live. So worship and prayer life were regular and disciplined, probably not drawing huge crowds, mainly because there were no large spaces, no giant cathedrals, no great temples for the Jewish people to gather in the exile and then in the cities, in the dispersion or the diaspora out around the country. So there were smaller groups that would gather for the prayers and the readings and the teachings of whatever rabbi happened to be there or leaders. But anyway, Paul was working in these communities as a tent or awning maker during the week, as it were. So Paul had these networks of where he worked, people coming to and from the shop, people walking up and down the streets. And so there were the adherents and there were the seekers also around the synagogue when he would go there. But some of these same people were probably, he had run into them other places because it was so concentrated. People did not go into their gated communities and have privacy fences around their yard and home. These were folks bumping into each other in this crowded and congested area and in the market where they would have to shop. And so there's lots of bumping into and interaction and the working of networks, of meeting people and finding out who's who and who goes to synagogue and who's a seeker or an inquirer or an adherent among those Gentile folks that Paul is looking for. And I am sure he's, how about a conversation about religion? And so they would talk. And that's, I think I've already told you that within the Jewish culture, they're not afraid to argue and debate and discuss. I think I've told you that I go to Temple Israel over here, or the synagogue where Charles Sherman was the rabbi, and they have a clergy institute every year. And we had one of the scholars was telling us, there's a story about in a little bar, a little pub in the Jewish community where an older guy is sitting at the bar and a young man comes in with wearing the yarmulke, and the older man looks at him and says, "So, how about an argument?" And they aren't afraid to discuss and debate because they understand that we hone our thinking and our analysis and our reasoning as we debate with each other. We don't assume the other is evil and totally wrong, but not quite on target. And so in a debate or an argument, either I discover I'm not right on target. I need to adjust in order to be more accurate in my thinking and reasoning, or I will show the other that they're not right on target. And however it comes out, either I am affirmed and confirmed and I'm seeing it right, or I get my vision corrected, or the other does. Or we both learn from each other and we both correct our vision as we hear each other and we sharpen our analysis and our understanding. So that was alive then too. And that's what Paul does, his whole letters are, this process of back and forth. You've said, and some are saying that they think this way and they think that way. Well, let me tell you how it ought to be. And we know, or assume, Paul is writing these letters in answer to things that have come to him. And that there was this back and forth. And that it didn't stop when he moved on. It continued with the letters. And he wanted to get back there, so he had more time to correct what he thought were the errors. But anyway, so there was this contact for him to work with people and discuss and teach and do this arguing. Now Now, the question of how many Christians were there, the communities of Christ followers in the way was most likely small, little groups, hardly ever a group 100, and probably never exceeding 100, more like a couple or 3 dozen, possibly, scattered out among the Roman Empire in 60 of the Common Era. The Pentecost story that says 3,000 were baptized and joined was probably exaggeration, hyperbole to say, boy, it was a big crowd. It was wonderful. And there were probably a lot. But we know Scripture uses hyperbole quite often. It doesn't mean it didn't happen and that there weren't people there, but it's just a process of storytelling. You know, we exaggerate to make it a bigger, more exciting story. But something really happened, but maybe the details have gotten stretched. Anyway, Paul's communities that he established were perhaps only a few dozen or more there, but there were no church buildings. And the Jews in the synagogue didn't want to encourage this Jewish Christian way of thinking, so they didn't open their doors and say, well, sure, you can use the church on Monday night and Wednesday night. We don't do anything that night. You know, gather as many as you want and teach whatever you want. No, they wouldn't be encouraging this heresy as they saw it. So, although they were open and welcoming for synagogue worship, but they were kind of in control as much as they could be of what was taught and what was experienced then. So the Christians had to go somewhere else, and there were no big areas. The most probable thing that Crossan and Borg say was they were probably meeting in those ground floor shops. And at most, they might be 10 by 20 feet. These are about 12 inches. Are these 12 inches? Almost. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So only about that big a space to hold church. They might have gone upstairs into the apartments, and if they were having the Lord's Supper and serving a meal, remember we had the upper room for the Last Supper, some kind of apartment, but still pretty small and cramped. We know later on, and maybe a few in the early times, that there might have been a wealthy convert like Lydia, who would offer her larger home, might have had a villa, but for the most part, probably not until later. So we have the image of house churches, but Crossan and Borg say our image probably ought to be shop churches. And rather than gathering everybody together at one time, it's probably little groups, sort of like prayer groups that we have often nowadays would be meeting in people's homes or little study groups. Now we know that the first day of the week was the Lord's Day, and it's our Sunday by our reckoning, and we go by when the tomb was found empty on the third day after Friday, and then at sunset on Friday it becomes Saturday, the beginning of Sabbath. And then at sunset on Saturday, it turns into the third day, our Sunday. And so it is Sunday when it goes past sundown the night before to sunrise the next morning. It is still Sunday, Easter Sunday, and stays Easter Sunday until sundown Sunday evening, and then turns into Monday at Sunday. Our Sunday evening turns into Monday. So, if sundown, by Jewish calculations, was the transition from one day to the next, not 12 midnight, then our Saturday evening becomes Sunday for first century Jewish Christians. and their Friday evening becomes the Sabbath at sundown, and all the next day was Sabbath. That is, Saturday until like our Saturday evening, that then would become Sunday, the first day of the week at sundown on Saturday. Now they could break the Sabbath restrictions Saturday evening, Sunday morning at 6 p.m. and do whatever different things that they could do. Remember, they were still Jews, and many wanted to follow Jewish Sabbath rules and laws and so forth. Now the problem is often early followers of Jesus in the way, mainly Christian Jews, would have to meet at night after dark in order to worship for their meals of the Lord's Supper. To remember, the Lord's Supper was an evening meal. Now, was that our Saturday night turn Sunday morning when they would gather and have that worship? Now, the beginning of the Lord's Day would still be there until sunrise and then ending the next day. As I was trying to think that out and make the mental adjustment from our time reckoning back to their time reckoning, I wonder if Greeks and Gentiles might not have calculated that way. I don't know. I have never read. Anybody read? Dolores? How did they calculate the change of the day? And if they meet at night, then according to the Jewish calculation, if they met at night, it would be the first of the next day. It wasn't the end of the day they'd just gone through. And so how do you calculate the Lord's Day for Christian worship as distinct from their Jewish worship? Well, it kind of is, but it was the Lord's Day. The early Christians were worshiping as Christians separately from synagogue, but they continued synagogue and temple worship as well and still continued in the Jewish faith, but they were like a sect within. So if the Greeks and Gentiles might have calculated another way, perhaps beginning the day like we do in our experience, we begin the new day when we wake up at sunrise or early in the morning. For us, that's the beginning of our day. You know, we just kind of look at it that way. We realize if we waked up or didn't go to bed until after midnight that, yeah, our clock calendar would trip over and it would say the next day. But we don't really think of it being the next day. We feel like this is still the night of the following day. And, you know, when we wake up for the morning, even if it's before sunrise, but most of us it's after sunrise, that for us is the beginning of our new day when we get up in the morning. So if that's kind of our physical, psychological experience, then that could have easily been translated into the official way of reckoning of Greeks and Gentiles. The new day begins at sunrise, and you don't get a new day until the next sunrise. So if lots of the Christians who followed Paul were Greek and Gentile, then did they reckon differently on the Jews of when and how to worship the Lord's Day? I don't know. Someone would probably tell me, you're thinking it. Bobby's always telling me, Dad, you're thinking that too much. Just let it go. Go with it. Yeah, I mean, it is, you know, when did sundials get invented? And they track, you know, hours of the day. But it's, anybody seen a moon dial? Well, anyway. We're fairly sure weekly gatherings for synagogue-style worship continued at the synagogue for some time before the conflicts and struggles for, as Croson and Borg would say, mostly for those adherents. And another part of that is a lot of those adherents were well-educated and well-to-do. And if the synagogue was losing them and their money resources, they would not be happy. And they would be angry with the Christians for dragging them away. But the Lord's Supper on the Lord's Day every week, we're not sure. Was it once a month? Or was it multiple times during the week? Whenever they gathered, they probably shared a meal. And then as a part of the meal, it was very easy to take the bread and remember that Jesus broke the bread and blessed it and said, "This is my body given for you." As they took the cup of wine, which is a normal part of the meal, and he says, "Do this as often as you drink it," which would mean it could be every meal that had this sacred quality when Christians gathered, when 2 or 3 are gathered in my name. So it could have been more often. Since they were such small groups, they didn't have to set a particular time once a week where everybody would adjust their calendars and we'd all go to church. They didn't have a church. They gathered where they were, crowded together in close proximity within the cities. So, anyway, we don't know for sure. So, if anybody is home alone for Christmas and doesn't have anything else to do, you can bring a report next Sunday, and I'll give you extra credit. We move on. The next big question is all the titles for Jesus and all that His coming was supposed to mean, in that He was, Son of God. He was supposed to bring world peace, the Prince of Peace. All of these titles were also the very same titles that were given to Caesar. And so what is the difference between what Paul attributes and what the Roman imperial theology attributes to these titles, and how are they different and how are they similar? Anyway, that's where we're going next time. Also next time, David's, I don't know if he's announced it yet, he's taking a vacation time next Sunday. I'll be preacher for Big Church. So I'll be busy. 2 services, our class, communions. So anyway, pray for me this week that I can get ready. I'm also a husband and a father and a grandfather, and Christmas is this week, and all of our extra services, and da-da-da-da-da. Let us pray. Dear God, this time of year is supposed to be joyous and full of happiness and love. We pray that it might be, and that all the good things that we hope will happen, and that if there are any disappointments and frustrations, let your peace settle in on us, and let us take deep breaths and remember that you are the God of love, and if we will allow your Spirit within us, then we can radiate that Spirit and change whatever the atmosphere and climate is around us. In Christ's name, amen.